Thank you for joining Wars of the Roses. And this is Legends of Glastonbury Abbey by Manly P. Hall, an article taken from Horizon, the Magazine of Useful and Intelligent Living, Volume 18, Number 2, Autumn 1958. From the ruined abbeys of Britain, Glastonbury Abbey. Legends of Glastonbury Abbey by Manly P. Hall. The little Saxon market town of Glasstingabyrig, a name which has been rather sensibly modified to Glastonbury, lies on the main road from London to Exeter in Somerset, England. The town is described as lying in the midst of orchards and water-meadows, anciently fens. Out of the marshes rises a hill achieving the elevation of 500 feet. This is the Tor, or Tower Hill, and the summit is ornamented by St. Michael's Oratory. The Tor, which commands a wide area, was an ancient British fortress, and before the advent of Christianity, the crest of the Tor is said to have been dedicated to the sun god, in whose honor fires were kindled as a part of Druidic religious ceremonialism. The River Brue winds in a serpentine course through Somerset Shire, and at Glastonbury there is a peninsula or island in the stream, separated in early times from the mainland by marshes and streamlets. On this island, apple trees abounded, and in honor of this, the strip of land came to be called the Isle of Avalon and was known to the Romans as Insula Avalonia, when Joseph of Arimathea and his companions resolved to settle in this region. They were granted 12 hides of land, probably originally amounting to 1,500 or 2,000 acres. We have referred to the legends of Glastonbury because so much of the early history of this religious establishment can scarcely be regarded as historical. We must doubt reports that the Apostle Peter reached Britain, establishing churches and ordaining priests and bishops in AD 37, even though Edward the Confessor claimed to have experienced a vision confirming the event. Nor can much more be advanced to support the belief that St. James, the son of Zebedee, had been an evangelist to Britain. St. Paul and St. Simon Zelotes are said to have visited the British island as missionaries. The reference to a bishop of Britain in AD 56 is also beyond confirmation. The first name about which some integrated report is available is that of Joseph of Arimathea, a wealthy man of Jerusalem and a member of the Sanhedrin. We are still in a realm of legends, but at least the accounts are orderly and detailed. This Joseph of Arimathea became a disciple of Jesus Christ, and after the crucifixion caused the body of the Lord to be placed in a tomb newly built, which Joseph had intended to contain his own remains. In the perilous times following the crucifixion, St. Philip and St. Joseph, together with Lazarus, his sisters Martha and Mary, and a serving woman in their household, were placed in a boat without sails or oar and turned adrift upon the sea. Though their plight appeared hopeless and their little craft was tempest-tossed, they at last came in safety to the town which we now know as Marseille. St. Philip, who was recognized as the head of this intrepid little band, began to preach at Marseille. After a time, their numbers having strengthened and their condition becoming less perilous, Philip sent Joseph, with his son Joseph and 10 others, on an expedition to Britain as missionaries to this remote land. It is said these travelers were led by an invisible hand, which brought them to a dark and dismal region, heavily forested, swampy underfoot, and covered with a leaden sky, usually heavy with fogs. At that time, Arviragus was the prince or chieftain of the district, and in his court the missionaries were entertained with great kindness. Arviragus listened respectfully to the doctrines which the strangers had brought, and also to their plans for the establishment of a holy house. This chieftain, after due consideration, declined to renounce his own faith or follow the teachings of these unknown wanderers who had been banished from their own land for heresy. With unusual liberality of mind, however, he permitted them to settle in his dominion, and was moved to grant them 12 hides of land, one for each member of their company. Here they could settle and teach their doctrines according to their own convictions. This is a summary from Caesar Baronius, quoting from the Acts of Mary Magdalene and her companions on the dispersion after the death of Stephen. The same historian also gives 2 additional sources for the idea that Joseph of Arimathea was with the original group which sailed from France to Britain. The incident is recorded in the Chronicle of Pseudo-Dexter and in A History of England, preserved in manuscript in the Vatican Library. After leaving the court of Arviragus, St. Joseph and his followers journeyed as best they could through the forests and marshes, until they came at last to an elevated place called Weary All Hill. They arrived at this dreary-sounding place precisely on Christmas Day, and paused to rest and survey the region. St. Joseph then thrust his long staff into the earth and led his companions in prayer, asking for divine blessing and guidance. While this was occurring, savage peoples had come out of the gloomy forest. They were clad in the skins of animals and carried crude weapons which they brandished ominously. Seeing, however, that the strangers were kneeling in some kind of devotion, the natives did not make any effort to injure them. As the group of evangelists arose from their devotions, they beheld a miracle. The dried and withered staff of Joseph, which he had struck into the earth, had sprung into life, budded, and put forth white blossoms. There is an old legend that this staff of Joseph was the origin of the Glastonbury thorn, an unusual variety of hawthorn which flourished only in this area of England. Botanists have trouble with this elusive plant. Some think it originated in Morocco, others that it came from Siberia. Certainly it was not indigenous. The Glastonbury thorn flowers twice a year, about Christmas time and again in May. The original thorn tree was cut down in 1653 by a fanatical soldier in the army of Oliver Cromwell. Before this time, however, many slips had been taken from it, and these still blossom around the time of the winter solstice. It is possible to propagate this thorn only by budding and grafting. According to popular account, the Glastonbury thorn is of the same variety as that used to make the wreath of thorns which was placed upon the head of Christ, and there is indication that this plant was venerated prior to the destruction of the abbey. It is still believed to have mystical virtues, and many pilgrims visit the area especially to see this remarkable thorn. The budding of the staff was regarded by Joseph of Arimathea as evidence that the new religious community should be established on the site of Weary All Hill. And the settlers decided to build a small wattled church according to the directions given by the angel Gabriel. Around the building, the ground was duly sanctified to become a churchyard. Here the 12 labored together, converting many to the Christian religion. It was in this church that St. Joseph himself was later buried. Although the early Protestant historical writers in England were inclined to regard the story of Joseph of Arimathea as doubtful, it must be recalled that the charters issued by the Normans, in connection with religious edifices, give reference to the older Saxon charters, and among the most ancient of these, St. Joseph is recognized as the founder of the church. From 2 Glastonbury legends, Joseph of Arimathea. The building of the community was a laborious procedure, and the first consideration was protection against the almost constant dampness. From what can be learned, each of the 12 missionaries constructed a hut with wattled walls and a thatched roof. These were located on the individual hides of land which had been allocated to them. They then built their church, constructed similarly of hurdles interlaced with twigs and a high-pitched roof of thatch. An ancient symbol referring to this shows a larger central building surrounded by 12 smaller ones in an arrangement reminiscent of the Israelitish tabernacle in the midst of the 12 tribes. Warner, in his History of Glastonbury, says, "The first 6 centuries were involved in historical gloom, confusion, and obscurity, where no real form can be apprehended and where the eye is cheated with vain visions instead of beholding actual existences, and curiosity must be satisfied with legends and fables in the room of incontrovertible certainty or even rational probability." Frederick Ross, in The Ruined Abbeys of Britain, London, ND, gives an excellent summary of the probable form of the original community. At first, they can scarcely be regarded as a monastic body, although after the apostolic fashion they would live in common, but without any regular rules or vows, and would go forth without any set order to preach to and teach the rude Britons, and it would appear not without success, as they remained fixed on the same spot, not perhaps altogether without let or hindrance, and the tradition says that their early church was built by their converts. They would probably form themselves into what was termed a laura, the germ of subsequent monarchism, a society of men living in separate dwellings, submitting themselves to a superior, and leading lives of abstinence, with alternations of work, prayer, and silent contemplation combined with missionary journeys amongst the natives. They would probably develop into a more regular system in accordance with the rules of the Egyptian monks, founded on the institutes of Pachomius, the main features of which were to eat with their hoods on so as not to see each other's faces, cast their eyes about or hold converse with each other, to repeat certain prayers 36 times in every 24 hours, and to sleep for not more than 3 hours at a time on sloping boards, each in a separate cell. Fragments of the history of Glastonbury during the early period can be briefly summarized. According to William of Malmesbury, circa 1080 through circa 1143, prominent early English historian Lucius, king of the Britons, was converted to Christianity in AD 177. About this time, the old wattled church, having become a ruin, was rebuilt in stone, dedicated to the Saviour and to the apostles Peter and Paul. Soon afterwards, Lucius divested the Druids of their spiritual and temporal powers and proclaimed Christianity the religion of his realm. About this time also, the chapel of St. Michael the Archangel was built and dedicated on the nearby Tor Hill. Of this, only the tower, dating from the rebuilding of 1271, still remains. William of Malmesbury wrote that St. Patrick, the apostle to Ireland, after completing his work, retired to Glastonbury, becoming the first monk and then abbot. He died there in the year AD 472 at the age of 111 years and was buried at the right side of the altar. Some question remains as to the accuracy of this report. See Gesta Regum, AD 1125. After its founder, the name most associated with Glastonbury is the half-historical, half-mythical hero Arthur, King of Britain, who flourished in the early half of the 6th century. His true life history is utterly obscure, but in time romantic stories about him were widely circulated. This Arthur successfully defended his country against the Saxon Cerdic, and according to tradition he also defeated the Irish, the Icelanders, the Romans and the Norsemen. William of Malmesbury was acquainted with the legendary surrounding King Arthur and his order of chivalry. Torn between his natural tendency to be a serious chronicler of sober fact and the extravagances of the law which he endeavored to record, William unfortunately showed a conservative course and refused to repeat the popular fables. He did note, however, as typical of the idle tales of the Britons, that this King Arthur caused the figure of the Lord's mother to be embroidered on his armor and thus protected, attacked 900 of the enemy himself alone, and put them to flight with incredible slaughter. See Gesta Regum. Arthur gathered his faithful knights into the Order of the Round Table, and the many brave members of this circle quested far and near for the sangreal, the holy vessel used by Jesus and his disciples at the Last Supper. The legends tell us that when Arthur was mortally wounded in the Battle of Camlan in AD 542, while fighting against his nephew Modred, he was carried away to fairyland in a phantom ship draped with black. This fairyland was the Isle of Avalon. Several other accounts also sustain this legend. Geoffrey of Monmouth mentions in his account of the Arthurian legends that after King Arthur was mortally wounded in the battle on the river Cambula, he was carried thence to the Isle of Avalon for the healing of his wounds. There is a Latin poem on the life of Merlin, written about the time of Geoffrey, and some say by him, in which the Welsh bard Taliesin is caused to describe the strange voyage of the wounded King Arthur to the Isle of Apples, called the Fortunate Isle. Here Morgan, one of the 9 mysterious sisters who ruled the isle, dressed Arthur's wounds and declared that he would recover if he was willing to remain for a long time in her care. Giraldus, another early author, gives a slightly different version. He distinctly tied the Isle of Apples with the site of Glastonbury. According to him, Morganus, a noble matron who ruled in this region and was allied by blood to King Arthur, carried him from the battlefield to the isle now called Glastonia. Elbert W. Richards, in his article Glastonbury Rosicrucian Abbey, points out that the place which the Saxons had named Glasstingabyrig was called by the Britons Winwes war Avalon, which in Latin is Avalonia, meaning Isle of Apples. It would certainly appear, therefore, that King Arthur was taken to Glastonbury, and in all probability he was taken to the old chapel, where he stayed with the holy men until his death. His remains were then placed in the sacred ground nearby. In due course, his queen, Guinevere, who had retired to the nunnery at Amesbury, came also to the end of her life. Her remains were brought to Glastonbury, placed in a web of lead and then a coffin of marble, and laid in the earth beside her husband. The bodies of these celebrated persons remained undisturbed for 640 years. Then, at the suggestion of King Henry II, the relics were found and interred within the church in 1191. Again, the version of Giraldus varies on this incident. He tells us that the body of King Arthur was discovered in 1191 under rather prosaic circumstances. When a certain monk of the abbey died, his brethren attempted to fulfill his last wish, namely that he should be buried between two pyramid-like monuments in the cemetery of the abbey. While digging the grave for their deceased brother, the monks discovered the casket of King Arthur. Both of these accounts differ from the official report left by Adam of Domreham, who wrote about 1290. After some historical data relating to the accession of Henry de Sully as abbot, he goes on to say, "This abbot, having been frequently admonished concerning the more honourable placing of the famous King Arthur, for he had rested near the old church between two stone pyramids, notably engraved in former times, for 648 years, on a certain day set curtains round the spot and gave orders to dig. When they had dug to an immense depth and were almost in despair, they found a wooden sarcophagus of wondrous size, enclosed on every side. When they had raised and opened it, they found the king's bones, which were incredibly large, so that one shin bone reached from the ground to the middle of a tall man's leg, and even further. They found also a leaden cross having on one side the inscription, Hic jacet sepultus inclitus rex Arthurius in insula Avalonia. After this, they opened the tomb of the queen who was buried with Arthur, and found a fair yellow lock of woman's hair plated with wondrous art, but when they touched it, it crumbled almost to nothing." Domreham also speaks of the reinterment in the great church. The cross of lead found in King Arthur's grave is reproduced herewith. From two Glastonbury legends, the leaden cross found in King Arthur's grave. The question may naturally arise as to the circumstances which inspired the search for the remains of the British hero at Glastonbury. The answer seems to lie in tradition, and King Henry, according to Giraldus, learned of the secret grave from Welsh bards. Actually, Avalon may not have originally signified a locality, but rather a name given by the Celts to the blessed place beyond the grave. It was also a strong belief that Arthur and his knights were being held in a magic sleep and would someday return to re-establish the mighty order of the Table Round. The fact that Avalon was deeply involved in the early Druidic lore, and that the region abounds in early, if not prehistoric, monuments, may well have centered the popular mind upon this romantic area. The overlapping references to the Isle of Apples supply justification for the assumption that this was the enchanted locality referred to in the Arthurian cycle. The Sangreal, or Holy Grail, for which King Arthur's brave knights so valiantly searched, is also involved in the Glastonbury legendary, although the association is somewhat dim and uncertain. The earliest references are to the book, which is called the Holy Grail. This seems to imply that a sacred manuscript rather than a cup is intended, and it is also noted that this grail speaks, giving oracles and words of holy consolation. There is probably a connection between the mystic cauldron of Celtic legendary and the cup which Joseph of Arimathea brought from Jerusalem. The magic cauldron was a vessel which miraculously refilled itself and occupied a prominent position in the old Druid mysteries. The sacred chalice which Joseph of Arimathea filled with the blood of the Lord at the crucifixion and brought with him to England could only be seen by the pure of heart. E.W. Richards relates the legend that Josephus II, the son of Joseph of Arimathea, foreseeing the time when the holy mysteries would be forgotten, buried the Holy Grail at Glastonbury in a secret place. This place is said to be the northern spur of Glastonbury Tor, and it is still called Chalice Hill. There is a holy well, or blood spring, from which crystal water bubbles up spontaneously on the spot on Chalice Hill where the Holy Grail is said to have been buried. The water from this spring is not affected by frost or drought, and no one has been able to determine its origin or direct its course. It is chalybeate water, and since the iron in it is easily oxidized, it leaves a red deposit on stones as it passes over them. The deposits are known as blood drops and are regarded as a confirmation of the origin of the spring. Early writers made no direct attempt to identify the Grail story with the Glastonbury tradition. It belongs essentially to the lore of King Arthur and his order of chivalry. The Holy Grail itself stood for a mystical experience, and around it arose the orders of the quest. Like the Celtic cauldron, it was a cup of mysteries and visions. It certainly represented the human heart, the most sacred organ of man's body, through which forever flowed the blood of the king. The quest for the inner life, the search for communion, turned inevitably toward the heart and the mysteries associated with the miracle of divine love. The legend that the Holy Grail is concealed at Glastonbury is comparatively late. It may well have represented the heart of Christianity in Britain, the Eucharistic cup used in the Holy Sacrament by Joseph of Arimathea and his successors. With such dramatic legendary and tradition associated with Glastonbury, it is small wonder that this church had many influential patrons in the course of its history, who saw to its various restorations and deposited treasures there. Near the end of the 6th century, Augustine, sent as a missionary to the Saxons by Pope Gregory I, became Archbishop of Canterbury and Primate of all England. The monks of Glastonbury thus came under Benedictine rules, which they accepted with some modifications. The most important name connected with the medieval history of Glastonbury was Saint Dunstan, 925 through 988, who was born nearby and received his education from its monks. He united himself with the Glastonbury fraternity and was in due course appointed abbot by King Edmund. St. Dunstan carried his own personality with a heavy burden, and his complex nature would have delighted a research psychologist. At Glastonbury, he constructed a cell 5 feet long, 2.5 feet wide, and about 6 feet high, lighted only by a trapdoor in the ceiling. Here he lived a most ascetic existence, combining his own devotion with a resolute determination to rescue the secular priesthood and monastic orders from the horrors of matrimony. St. Dunstan labored diligently to repair the damage wrought upon the abbey by the Danes. He was himself a skillful worker in iron, and he also had parts of the church rebuilt and enlarged. His ecclesiastical ambitions, however, led in the end to the restriction of his privileges, and subjected him to such royal ridicule that he is said to have died of vexation in 988. St. Dunstan was officially interred at Canterbury, but according to legend, his remains were brought secretly to Glastonbury, although according to one report, they were rediscovered at Canterbury in 1508. From the time of St. Dunstan, the affairs of Glastonbury continued for some years without unusual events. King Canute visited the abbey and presented a rich pall embroidered with apples of gold and pearls for the tomb of King Edmund Ironside. King Henry II energetically attempted to restore the abbey and was responsible for the Church of St. Mary, sometimes referred to as St. Joseph, which was dedicated in 1186. E.W. Richards gives this interesting note on the chapel of St. Mary. It was laid out on the lines of the wall of St. Paul, and in its floor was wrought a symbol which was to perpetuate the ancient mysteries. The floor was red, and in the center was the host in gold, and from it there were lines of black marking paths to the cells of the saints, which golden stars did mark. But even the monks knew not then what it all did mean. They thought there were but signs of stars. Yea, there were stars indeed for saints, and the sun in their midst, for him, the very sun Verity, and the Ecclesia Vestuta for Our Lady's robe, sheltering him who lay in the crib of Bethlehem for us. It was the mystery of faith which we of these latter days have forgotten. Glastonbury Rosicrucian Abbey, Mercury Magazine, September 1925. In 1275, the region of Glastonbury was visited by an earthquake which threw down the chapel of St. Michael on Tor Hill. This was rebuilt, but there is no detail as to the damage done to Glastonbury Abbey, although it undoubtedly sustained injury. Abbot Aegilwardus obtained a royal charter giving the monks of Glastonbury the right to elect their own abbot without interference by any bishop. This was confirmed by Pope John VIII. From the ruined abbeys of Britain, doorway of St. Joseph's Chapel, the rising temporal influence of Glastonbury resulted in a series of controversies and dissensions which disfigured the history of the abbey for for several centuries. King Edward I and his Queen Eleanor kept Easter at the Abbey in 1278, being present to witness the opening of King Arthur's shrine. This act of royal favour added fuel to the fires of dissension, and these smouldered, breaking into flame periodically until Henry VIII, with extraordinary vigour, terminated the conflict by eliminating most of the combatants. The early wattled church of Joseph of Arimathea was a humble testimony to the greatness of faith. In the course of centuries, we are told that it expanded rapidly into an immensity of grandeur and wealth, becoming a centre of holiness, a nursery of learning, and the burial place of kings and saints. This transformation brought down upon the abbey the envy of prince and prelate. Its glories were its undoing. At the time Henry VIII overthrew the temporal power of the Roman Church in England, there was no real evidence that the monks of Glastonbury were corrupt or lacking in spiritual dedication. They simply suffered from a policy aimed primarily at a general condition. About 50 were resident at Glastonbury and signed the acknowledgement of King Henry's supremacy. After the dissolution of the monastic system, the manor of Glastonbury, together with the church, churchyard and monastic buildings, were granted to Edward, Duke of Somerset, for the better maintenance of his dignity. They passed through other hands until 1806, when the holdings, divided into small lots, were sold for a total of £75,000. The Glastonbury legends took on renewed vitality when Frederick Bligh Bond, RFI, became Director of Excavations at Glastonbury for the Somerset Archaeological Society. This brilliant archaeologist was thoroughly acquainted with every aspect of Glastonbury tradition. His particular purpose was to discover the location of the Edgar Chapel, a project which had intrigued countless archaeologists before him. The Edgar Chapel was said to have contained priceless art treasures, but the site of the chapel had mysteriously somehow disappeared after Glastonbury Abbey was condemned by King Henry VIII in 1539. After every other means failed, Bond decided upon a dangerous course from a scientific standpoint. He sought to make contact with the ghosts of the old monks who had served the chapel. In 1908, he received automatic writing, and following its instructions exactly, he was able to clear the entire structure of the Edgar Chapel. And the building and the contents were found to be exactly according to the ghostly messages which he had received. Bond's discovery ranks among the most important archaeological achievements of the 20th century, and he credits it entirely to the guidance given by the dead Benedictine monks. Mr. Bond later published a detailed account of the messages he had received across the centuries. This is contained in 2 books, The Gate of Remembrance and The Company of Avalon. A general description of the abbey as it was in the 19th century may be of interest. The buildings were surrounded by a high stone wall enclosing approximately 60 acres. Few vestiges of the older glory remained, for the ruins supplied materials for the building of houses and barns and the repair of roads. The best preserved were St. Joseph's Chapel and the abbot's kitchen. The great gateway with its porter's lodge stood until the beginning of the last century, when it was removed to provide space for a store. The Chapel of St. Joseph, which stood on the site of the original sanctuary of the 1st century, is a noble example of Norman transitional architecture. The crypt beneath it, dating from the 15th century, had slowly filled with rubbish 7 or 8 feet deep. This was cleared in 1825, resulting in the discovery of early burials, fragments of statuary, and some other artifacts. The great church, including the Chapel of St. Mary and other structures gradually incorporated, was originally 594 feet long and cruciform in shape. For comparison, it may be noted that Westminster Abbey is 489 feet long. The existing remains of the original church are part of the south wall of the choir, part of the walls of the chapel in the north transept, portions of the arches for the support of the tower, and part of the south wall of the nave. Of the great library which was south of the refectory, nothing remains. Glastonbury Abbey, in its days of grandeur and wealth, included all the buildings necessary to the complete function of a comparatively isolated community. There were apartments for visiting bishops, an office for the doctor, rooms for novices and students, the vestry, the common wardrobe, the armory, the gravedigger's office, and such plebeian facilities as a buttery, a still house, a brew house, a pump house, and stables for the 8 horses assigned to the abbot. For those interested in further details of the original accommodations and such parts thereof as have survived, a number of books dealing with the abbey are available. It must be regarded now as an ancient, graceful ruin, not so different from similar neglected structures of many faiths scattered throughout the world. Thank you for watching, and please don't forget to share, like, subscribe, and comment, and if you can, please consider donating to Wars of the Roses. Links to PayPal and Patreon are in the description. Thank you so very much.